Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Digital Accessibility Regulations. My name is Alex McFarlane and I'm Chair of LG Comms. This webinar has been organised by the Government Digital Service, the LGA and LG Comms to help us better understand what the digital accessibility regulations mean for public sector bodies. The session will be led today by Richard Morton, Head of Accessibility at the Government Digital Service. Nancy Hell from GDS is also joining us. This is a hugely important and complex area, so we're really pleased to be able to hear from Richard today. And just before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Richard will present to us for 40 minutes, so that's 40 minutes of Richard's expertise, and then there'll be a chance for Q&A. So please post your questions as we go along in the Q&A function during the webinar. Please note, as I mentioned at the start, this session will be recorded and we will be sharing the recording with you afterwards along with Richard's slide deck, and we will finish promptly at 4 p.m. Now that's more than enough from me. Over to Richard.
Thanks, Alex. Welcome everyone. I'm Richard Morton. I'm Head of Accessibility at the Government Digital Service, or GDS. GDS is part of Cabinet Office and we lead the digital transformation of government, which means that we run things like the government website, gov.uk, among many other things. Today I'm here to talk to you about digital accessibility, and in particular in relation to the new public sector bodies accessibility regulations. Everything we create must be accessible to everyone, regardless of whether or not they have impairments in any of these areas: vision, hearing, speech, motor or cognitive, or a combination of them. For example, this means we must make sure you don't need to rely on sight alone to understand government communications material, whether that's information on a website or in documents or through any kind of communications. The text in the information should be accessible to a screen reader, which is a piece of software that's used to read out the text on a website for someone who's visually impaired. Similarly, we shouldn't rely on people being able to hear the audio of a film or animation and should provide caption text. I just need to go back because I've skipped a slide, unfortunately. Just a quick definition of what accessibility is. So digital accessibility is what we're talking about, and it means ensuring your services and content can be used and understood by the widest possible audience. In the UK, at least 1 in 5 people have a long-term illness, impairment or disability, and many more have a temporary or situational disability. The UK public has to use government services, whether that's central or local government. So although communications and campaigns have tailored audiences, everybody in the UK will at some point need to use a government service, and your information will help signpost them to those services. This means it's our responsibility as civil and public servants to make sure we remove as many barriers or obstacles to accessing our services as possible. It's the ambition of the Government Digital Service to make services as accessible and as inclusive as possible to ensure there are no barriers that might prevent people from interacting with government. So going on to talk a bit more about that point about impairments not always being permanent. They can be situational or temporary. Sometimes people don't have use of one of their senses temporarily due to illness or injury, such as having an ear infection, a burst eardrum or a cold. And we must also consider people who don't have full access to things through their senses because of the situation they're in. That could be being in a noisy environment like an open plan office, or working on a train or something like that, that prevents you being able to hear as clearly. User needs need to be considered and met, whether an impairment or disability is permanent, temporary or situational. And it doesn't really make any difference in terms of how we design and build things, whether an impairment is temporary, permanent or situational. It affects people in the same way. So there are some underlying principles to digital accessibility that I just want to talk through. There's 4 principles, and these are outlined in the standards as well, so that they're named this for a particular reason. To successfully complete a transaction, whether that's completing a form or just getting information, 4 things need to be in place. And if any one of these fails, then the transaction fails. So first of all, someone needs to be able to perceive or receive information through one of the senses. That's the senses of sight or hearing, or it could be touch. Touch would be in the case of someone using something like a braille display. Secondly, you need to be able to understand. So you need to understand the content, the instructions, the navigation, everything on the page or document. They all need to be understood. So complex language, things like jargon can be barriers to this. Thirdly, you need to be able to operate things. So these are interactive elements on web pages. You need to have a means available to complete any action you need to do, whether that's opening a web page, acting on a link, operating a button, filling in a form control, or operating a media player or other complex control. And then fourthly, it needs to be robust. And that means it needs to work on the combination of operating system, browser, and assistive technologies used. So not just the latest versions of these. So, you know, it's not just across one platform, for example, Windows, it needs to work on Mac, but it's more important that it works across different browsers and assistive technologies used. Services need to be designed for people in the ways they need, not just online, but also including things like telephone, face-to-face, and letters as well. So it needs to be an inclusive service, not just from a digital accessibility point of view. Accessibility isn't something new for GDS. It's actually built into our design standards and ways of working. However, making online services accessible to all isn't just something we're passionate about, it's also the law. So what does the law actually say? Well, first of all, going back to older laws, if you like, the Equality Act 2010 says we have a legal obligation to provide equal access to people with disabilities. For Northern Ireland, this is slightly different. It's covered by the Disability Discrimination Act 1995, but in essence, it's the same legislation. We also have the public sector equality duty. In the Equality Act, it says that public authorities must comply with the public sector equality duty. This means that public organisations like central and local government, healthcare, education, must think about the needs of people who are disadvantaged or suffer inequality when they make decisions about how they provide their services and implement policies. So while the 2010 and 1995 laws have been in place for quite some time now, there are some newer online accessibility regulations that public organisations must follow. These don't replace or supersede the Equality Act or the public sector equality duty, but are in addition to it, or in fact they add new standards and new requirements to it. And these are known as the Public Sector Bodies Website and Mobile Applications Accessibility Regulations 2018, shortened often to the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations or just the Accessibility Regulations. They mean that public organisations have a legal obligation to make their websites and mobile apps accessible to people with disabilities. Any organisation in the public sector, with some exceptions, are obliged to meet the latest version of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That's WCAG, version 2.1 to level AA, and I'll explain a little more on that in a moment. They need to make sure their websites and apps, that's mobile apps, and documents are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust, as I explained just a little while ago. And they need to publish an accessibility statement. And this will make clear the level of accessibility across the site or application. And I'll speak a bit more about this later in the session too. WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is a set of recognised guidelines used across the world in various countries that can be followed to make components on a website accessible, or at least to help make components accessible. The guidelines are broken down into 3 levels. Level A is for websites with the most basic web accessibility features. Level AA is for websites that tackle the most common barriers for disabled users. And level AAA is for sites with the highest and most complex level of web accessibility. And just to remind you that the level required for the new legislation is level AA, and that includes level A and level AA. So there are some timings for the new regulations. The regulations came into force on September 23rd, 2018. New websites needed to be compliant by 23rd of September last year, 2019. Existing websites need to be compliant by this September, 23rd of September 2020, and mobile applications have a slightly later date. They need to be compliant by 23rd of June next year, 2021. Or to put that another way, any new websites launched now need to be compliant now, straight away at launch time. Existing websites need to be compliant by this 23rd of September 2020, which is less than 2 weeks away. And mobile apps need to be compliant by 23rd of June 2021. Okay, so that covers things like websites, but what about documents? And the answer is yes, documents are included. PDFs or other documents, which could be Word documents, open documents, any of those documents published on or after 23rd of September 2018 are in scope of the legislation, so need to be made accessible to the standard, the same standard. PDFs or other documents published before that date are exempt in the sense that you don't need to do anything to fix them unless users need them in order to use a service. It's up to you to decide what constitutes information that's needed to use a service, but for example, guidance on how to apply for a bulk waste collection would be considered necessary to use a service, whereas an annual report probably isn't. It's up to you to decide that though. And the next question, what about media, as in multimedia? Yes, that's in scope, but there are some restrictions on that, or some limitations if you like. Media that is in scope is pre-recorded media, that's videos, podcasts, that are published on or after 23rd of September 2020. So that's not yet, that's anything that's published after that date is in scope. Anything before that date doesn't have to be made accessible according to the regulations, but it's not exempt from things like the Equality Act, the Disability Discrimination Act. Live media, so if you're publishing something live online, for example, council meetings, that isn't in scope. You don't have to do things for that, but obviously it's best practice if you can provide captions and audio description for those. But if you do record that and then publish it, then it does come into scope of the regulations. And this is a question that does come up, you know, is this just about citizen-facing stuff? And the answer is no. It does include internal information and services and documents as well. It's a slightly different set of rules. Intranets and extranets are in scope, apart from content of intranets and extranets that's published before 23rd of September last year, until those websites undergo a substantial revision. Now that's quite a wordy sort of statement. What it means though effectively is if you've got an intranet and extranet that hasn't changed since before last September, you don't need to do anything specifically to make it accessible now. But if you change it substantially, then you will need to. There's no definition in the legislation of what substantial means, or even what a website means. So that's sort of up to your own interpretation. But for example, it's unlikely that changing a few pages of content would constitute a substantial revision, but changing the structure of an intranet or changing the underlying technology probably is. Intranets and extranets are interesting because there isn't a definition of what that is, but a common interpretation is an enclosed or restricted system, you know, that needs a login or needs a specific environment to use that has a browser interface. So that does cover not just traditional intranets, but also things like internal tools, case working systems, those sort of things. Most internal tools these days do have a browser type interface. GDS has published some guidance and other resources on gov.uk. You can visit gov.uk/accessibility-regulations to see what you need to do in order to be compliant. And that link is in the information at the end as well. That's the information about the legislation and the requirements, if you like. And I'll take questions about that later, but I would like to sort of talk a bit more about a strategy for accessible design. So this is more sort of principles, if you like, of good design and build for services and information. The goal here is to try and make things as accessible as possible for everyone, to be able to be used by people without vision or limited vision, without perception of colour, without hearing or with limited dexterity, with limited cognition, any combination of those sort of situations. And as I mentioned earlier, it can be situational impairments as well. Just, for example, working in a bright environment outside or trying to access information outside on a mobile phone makes it much more difficult to see low contrast text or small text. So it's about making sure that things work for everyone as much as possible. We often promote these posters from home office, which are the do's and don'ts of accessible design. There are actually 6 posters. I've just shown a picture of 3 of these here: physical and motor disabilities, deaf or hard of hearing, and designing for users with dyslexia. There's some really good, helpful advice on these, and these do kind of align with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but they explain things in a much more easily digestible and understandable way. So it's some simple tips and techniques, if you like, for designing things that are accessible for people. And yeah, we do sometimes get the credit for these at GDS, but I have to say it's Home Office who do this, and they do some great work on the accessibility front as well. At GDS, we did create some accessibility personas to use in our Accessibility Empathy Lab. If you look at my background, that's a picture of the Accessibility Empathy Lab at GDS, which we made available for people to visit, to understand a bit about how people use assistive technologies, understand sort of barriers people face, and to show some simulations of the sort of barriers people might face. So we created these personas to help with that, to help understanding of that. And this one, for example, is Ashley, who is a partially sighted screen reader user. And it gives some information about that person. These are freely available for use, and you can customize them and use them as you want. And we, in addition to creating personas, just to get understanding of user needs, we also created some sort of technical personas that could be used on things like Chromebooks or other Chrome browsers, to simulate some of the difficulties that might be faced by someone in this situation. So there's a whole series of them. We created 7. So Ashley is a partially sighted screen reader user. Christopher is a user with rheumatoid arthritis. Claudia is partially sighted screen magnifier user. Pavel is a user with Asperger's. Ron is an older user with multiple conditions. And Salim is profoundly deaf. And Simone is dyslexic, and they have different challenges, and the simulations can change the way they access things. So Ron is always an interesting one for me to show to people, because he has some degree of problems with cataracts, which means the screen is slightly blurry. So we blur things. So you can probably read main headings, but you can't read some of the information. And interesting, Ron, you know, we set it up so that Ron doesn't know how to use things like browser zoom. So he uses the default settings. But also with Ron, we know that he has arthritis and problems with fine motor control. So we simulated that with a mouse pointer that, as you move across the screen, it jumps about slightly randomly. So you can still click on links and things like that, but it's more difficult. So these sort of things are designed to, as I say, just show people the sort of difficulties some people might face. It's important to note, though, that we make it clear this isn't a simulation of someone's lived experience. It isn't a substitute for testing with someone who has a disability or accessibility needs. It's also important to think about this from a sort of design point of view. Every design decision has the potential to include or exclude people. So for example, in the physical world, if you think of a set of steps at the entrance of a building, that can exclude people who use wheelchairs or who can't manage steps easily. But a ramp can be inclusive, and that also works for most people. And this is no different in the sort of digital world as well. So thinking about the sort of strategy, if you like, part 1 is design for most users without modifications. So aim to write content that uses plain language and is clear and easy to understand. GovUK was built with the aim of trying to simplify things and make things use plain language. And it's important to note that the average reading age in the UK, for example, is 9 years old. So try and think about how to keep content simple. Don't use long words, avoid use of jargon. Where you have to use jargon, explain it or provide a glossary. Where you have to use acronyms, abbreviations, make sure you explain them unless they're really, really common. We tend to use the rule that if we think 80% of the population are going to know what an acronym, an abbreviation or acronym means, you don't necessarily have to explain it. So for example, I would say you don't need to explain what BBC means, but you would need to explain what GDS means, just as an example. So think about how you break up content as well. Write it like a report, perhaps. When you think about when you're back at school and you wrote an essay, you wouldn't write it in one long paragraph of text, or if you did, you'd probably get told to break it up, use headings, subheadings, use bullet points, make things more understandable. Also, it's important in terms of interactions for content. So make sure all form fields are labelled and don't use placeholder labels which disappear when focusing on a form control. This is just an example of, first name, last name, national insurance number. It's pretty obvious from the labels what the information being asked for is, but you'd be surprised how many forms don't have sufficient information for people to understand that. And there are technical ways that that needs to be made available to, for example, screen reader users. Also, think about colour contrast or contrast. I mentioned about, the situation in impairment where you might be working or using a phone outdoors that makes things difficult to see if they're very low contrast. So make sure that things have a decent basic level of contrast. So this is an example from the BBC. They follow their own standards, which do align to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they try and ensure every combination of text and background has good contrast. In this page, there's a cookie note with text in orange, well, possibly orange, I'm not quite sure, against a dark background which says, yes, I agree. Now that has reasonably good contrast. It's reasonably easy to read on that screen and even on mobile devices and things like that. But if that colour text, if you use the same colour text on a white background, it would be much harder to read for many people and in fact impossible for some. So that can be a real barrier. So here's an example where it's poor colour contrast for that reason. So this is orange and white in combination, and the two are quite pale colours, if you like. So they have a low colour contrast, making it difficult to read the content. And particularly if someone's looking at this in natural light. So, excuse me. So you could make this work by, if you did have orange text, it would work on a darker background, or for example, with the orange background there, darker text, it can be fixed. Another thing to think about is the size of controls. Provide large target areas for the buttons and controls. This is important not just for people who use a mouse or a trackpad, but may have limited fine motor control, but also for someone using a mobile device, which is increasingly common. I believe that more than 60% of traffic to local government websites is now on mobile devices. So it's important to make sure that things work well for touchscreen devices. So here's an example of a page where there is a list of an A to Z of services on the top right, just the letters A to Z. They're quite small and quite close together, which can make it difficult to sort of click on those links. So it's better to make them wider, spread out more, and perhaps structure it in a different way. Whereas here's an example of Wikipedia, not exactly the best design example in the world, but everything is nicely spread out with plenty of space to be able to click on those links. It's also important that to understand that people don't get things right when they fill in forms. So you need to provide good error messages, make them obvious, make them helpful. There's nothing worse than the form submits and doesn't tell you that there's errors in it or there's problems or doesn't give you helpful information. It's important to indicate things not just using colour as well. Some forms that I've seen just put a red border around a form control that's in error. And for someone with good vision, that might be obvious. For someone with good colour vision, that might be obvious. But for many people, it's not obvious. Make it obvious, make it helpful. So in this example, it says date of birth must be in the past. So it's not just saying this is wrong, incorrect information, but it's helping to identify what the issue is. And it's probably just a typo. Second principle of good design is to design for easy adaptation to different users. So you need to recognise that many people need to adapt the experience through their browsers or through their devices. through their operating systems. And for example, color. There's a number of different ways a user can change the colors on a website. My colleague Annika wrote this blog post some time ago, actually 3 years ago, on the different ways users can change colors through things like their own style sheets, through browser plugins, browser settings, operating system settings, high contrast mode in Windows, things like that. The important thing is to make sure that things will still work if people do change the color settings. So avoid things disappearing and make sure things like buttons don't change to look like plain text, which is a common problem. You don't have to ensure good color contrast in every possible combination of ways, though. It wouldn't be possible to test all these ways, but it's worth trying things with a high contrast mode, that sort of thing, to see if it causes problems, and test that with real users as well to see if that causes them problems. There's also a very common thing is for people to adapt the size of the text that they use on the screen. That can be done through the browser, or it can be done through the operating system. And this is a simple example of changing settings on a phone, a mobile phone, to allow larger text, which is fine. You know, some people, I do that for preference, but for some people they need that because they can't read the text below a certain size or in certain colors. So the important thing here is, though, to make sure that your website or app doesn't prevent this from working, and also that layouts don't break or content doesn't become obscured when users change settings, or it becomes so it's not understandable. Another thing to think about is to allow people to extend time limits. Time limits are often in place on forms that you might need to fill in, particularly if it's a sort of limited time thing like Eventbrite, for example, will give you something like 10 minutes to fill in a form before it cancels. Online banking is, in this example, is an online banking session that's due to expire in 60 seconds, and it gives the user a warning. So it's fine to have a timeout, and it can be important from a security point of view or for other reasons, but you need to ensure that the user has a warning of this and that they have a simple way of extending that, either a button or something like that. And they need to be able to extend that time limit. Because for some people, it can take a lot longer to fill in a form or to complete a task, or even just to read through information. It might be terms and conditions or something like that, which everybody reads, of course. But it can take some people a lot longer. And just doing this doesn't just help somebody who may have a cognitive disability or a physical disability, but it helps that people generally, you know, if I'm filling in a complex form, I often need to go and find information from the filing cabinet or something like that. And that can take time, and it's, you know, frustrating if you get timed out automatically. Then the third principle around this is what I'd call complementary design, providing alternatives to meet the different needs of users. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, some complex things are difficult to make fully accessible. Sometimes solutions exclude people and you need an alternative. And you might think, well, that sounds strange because we're trying to make everything simple and accessible. But there are situations. So for example, a map, or in this case, an interactive map, it can be very difficult to make fully accessible. First of all, there's lots of complex information in a map. So think about what is the most important information in the map in the context it's used. In this example, it is an interactive map. It's about flood warnings, but it isn't important to know, for example, that Blackburn is more or less directly north of Altrincham in this map, but that might be in other contexts if you're navigating or whatever, that sort of thing. So context is very important in this sort of situation. But what's important though in this map is things like the warning pins, map pins, which indicate flood alerts, flood warnings at different levels. And you need to be able to locate them on the map. You need to be able to get the information on where those places are. You need to be able to distinguish the different types. There's two different types shown on there. There's an orange one and a red one for different levels of flood. There's also, from an interactive point of view, lots of options for things like scrolling, clicking on pins, zooming into the map. And the good news is most of those controls can be made more accessible, so you don't have to use necessarily a touchscreen or a trackpad or a mouse to access those. But there still can be some challenges with that. For example, somebody using voice recognition, how would they zoom into that page? You've got to think about how you name things and how they're labelled. So this is an example, as I say, of something that's complex information, difficult to make accessible. And it would have been very difficult to make the information in that map accessible if it hadn't been built using the principles of what's known as progressive enhancement. And what that means is you start with the basic text, data for the information, and you add structure to that. Then you consider things like graphical map can be an enhancement to that. So on the left-hand side of this page, it talks about different types of warnings. There's 0 severe flood warnings. It tells you what that means. A severe flood warning is, so a severe flooding is danger to life. There's 2 flood warnings, and it tells you where those are, the river Irwell, backup, and another one. So all that information is there in the data on the left-hand side, and the map then can be considered, if you like, an enhancement to provide more information for people who want to dig deeper into that. But it's not perfect. You can't make everything absolutely accessible in terms of a map, but you can do the best you can. And it's important to think the context, as I say, and maybe in this context, people want to know about not just where the number of warnings or the number of alerts, but if there are clusters of those in particular places. So you might need to summarize the data in some way. And that obviously is difficult to do if you're doing it automatically. Then the fourth principle around this is to design with a view to work with assistive technology. I'll just explain a bit about what assistive technology is. Just to say, ensure it works in the broadest range of technology possible. But assistive technology is kind of any object or system that increases or maintains the capabilities of people with disabilities. Now, there are examples in the real world, so things like a walking stick, a wheelchair, a pair of glasses could be considered assistive technology. And here's an example of that, if you like. This is a little magnifying lens and a short mini, not a telescope, it's like a telescope, but it's a shorter range. And that's useful for someone reading presentations in the room who may have certain visual impairments. There's a pair of tinted glasses there, again, which can help with certain visual impairments, or for someone with certain types of dyslexia. So these are kind of physical things. There's another example here, which is a keyboard overlay for a Mac, which provides a higher contrast, larger text on the keyboard and can help with reading those keys. But predominantly I'm talking about assistive technology in a digital sense. So the most commonly known or used example of that is Screen Reader. And a Screen Reader is a piece of software that reads out the content on a page, not just the content, but the structure as well. So it will tell you if things are a heading, it'll tell you if something's a button, it'll tell you how you can interact with things. And it's important to make sure that things work well with Screen Reader software and other assistive technology. That's just there's a blog post by Leonie Watson there about how to make things work well for Screen Reader. Other types of assistive technology are important as well. So there are things like screen magnifier software, which can go above and beyond what magnification in browser Zoom can do and what magnification on the operating system can do. And do things like change pointers, change colors, change backgrounds, lots of things like that. And there are the other main type of technology that's in use is voice recognition, which is becoming more mainstream because a lot of people are using it on their phones to even just to write text and things. A lot of people use voice, but for some people that's essential. Maybe some of the time, maybe all the time. It could be somebody with MS, multiple sclerosis, for example, who can use keyboard and mouse some of the time, but needs times when they don't have to do it all the time. So they might use voice recognition. And for that, they need to be able to control things. They need to be able to operate buttons, and things need to be named well. There are some principles about how to do that in code. Another type of technology, commonly used assistive technology, is kind of readers, which will read out and highlight text on the page. And that's particularly useful for someone who is either mildly visually impaired or has a cognitive impairment, such as they may be dyslexic, and it can help with understanding the content. Then the fifth principle is around the importance of user research or user testing to make sure that these things work for the people who need to use it. So it's important to include a range of people with disabilities in your user research and do that throughout the project. Maybe not from the very early stages, depending on how accessible things are going to be. If you're working with paper prototypes, for example, that might be challenging, but include people throughout the project. And it's probably the most important thing to think about. So yeah, if there's one thing you do this, make sure you test with people with disabilities, particularly those who use assistive technologies or make adjustments, and you will find things that you wouldn't have thought of, you won't have anticipated. There's another series of posters actually from Home Office on how to do access for researching access needs, who to include at what stages. That's pretty useful as well. There'll be a link in the notes for the presentation you can use for that. So finally, just remember that all this work, what we do to make things accessible, should help improve information and services and make them accessible to more people. That's for everyone. It's for all our users, including the most vulnerable, because just to remind you that, you know, most people need to use government services at some point, and they don't have a choice. They can't go somewhere else for their passport. They can't go to another local authority to get their bulk waste collection. They don't have a choice. They have to go to your organisation, your website. So we need to make sure things work for everyone as much as possible. So thanks very much, everyone, and happy to take questions. I believe Nancy's going to sort of read through some of those.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That's a great presentation. So we do have some questions. So someone has asked, we have been contacted by many companies saying that they can help us achieve accessibility compliance, Cite More, Cite Improve, Monsido, I'm not sure how you say that. They all publicly rank our websites, but the scores seem to vary, making it confusing for us to assess where we are. Could you please offer some advice on this?
It is a complex market. These tools can be useful. We've used tools like Cite Improve. We've used online free tools as well, like Wave and things like that. And they can analyze your websites and they can find a number of issues, but no automated tool is able to find all the potential issues on a website. As an example, there's a bit of code which tells screen reader the alternative text for an image. And any of these tools should be able to check whether an image has alternative text or not. But what they can't do is tell whether that's suitable alternative text or even whether it's needed. It might be a decorative image that doesn't need alternative text. So there are limitations, and yes, we've done a sort of analysis of the various tools on how good they are in terms of coverage. And they vary somewhat, and there is always the possibility of false positives or false negatives, depending on how you look at it. So use them. They're really important. They're really useful, particularly some of the tools you can integrate into your web development, so that when you make changes to your website, it'll automatically pick up on things which are probably coding type errors. They're really useful, but don't rely on it as the only means of testing the accessibility of your website.
Great, thank you. Someone else has asked, where can we find a list of AA and A specification? Is there already a platform that will assess whether we are already compliant?
The specifications are in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. If you look for WCAG 2.1 Quick Ref in Google, you'll find a quick reference guide to that. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are a complex set of documents, unfortunately, and they're not very easy to read and understand. You might be better off looking at our guidance on gov.uk for accessibility. If you look in the service manual under accessibility, there's a series of documents in there about, there's a thing called a WCAG primer which explains things. There's also information about how to test on our guidance. There's simplified testing, more complex testing. So while the specifications are there, I wouldn't recommend you go into that unless you have sort of some knowledge of accessibility. It does need some expertise. It's slightly ironic, really, that the guidance isn't particularly accessible and understandable in itself. I'm not sure, is there a platform that will assess whether already compliant is about, unless it's about the previous question as well, about tools and things. There isn't, you know, there isn't a tool or a platform that can do that. There are organizations who can help with that. You can access those through the digital marketplace. There are a lot of, well, there are many, there are a number of good providers of those sort of services who can help with that. But yeah, there isn't any kind of tool or platform that will do that fully automatically.
Okay. I've got another question. We're a district council who manage and host a wide range of complex PDF planning documents. Many of these have maps and complex diagrams, some of which are produced by third parties. How do we go about making these accessible for everyone?
Okay, that's quite a complex thing to do. Yes, there are a lot of PDF documents published throughout the public sector, particularly in government, particularly in local government, and planning documents are a difficult area. Technically, in the regulations, maps are exempt from the new regulations, but they're not exempt from the Equality Act. So if someone needs that information and they can't access it through the way you've published it, you will need to provide them with an alternative means of getting that information. But that's more a sort of on request thing, or can be on request. Complex diagrams aren't excluded, and that can be a tricky area. You need to try and explain those in text form, and that can be difficult from a technical point of view. Alternative text shouldn't be that long, so infographics, they're quite difficult to explain. If it's graphical information, if it's graphs in the sense of, you know, bar charts, pie charts, that sort of thing, often that can be conveyed through data tables as well. But yes, complex infographics are difficult. If they're produced by third parties, there is a slight exemption, or there is an exemption if they're produced by third parties and you don't procure them or you don't pay for them. So that's an important distinction, if you like. If you're paying a third party for content, then you are responsible for the accessibility of it. But if you're thinking in here, the example of an architect providing a planning drawing or something, which is a common thing, those I think would be probably exempt. But I have to sort of say, I'm not a lawyer, and you would need to check with your legal advisors on that.
Thank you. Oh, I've missed one. How are websites judged whether they are compliant or not? Is there a percentage mark?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. In terms of the legislation, you're supposed to make everything fully compliant with the level A and AA success criteria. There's a list of 50 different things you need to meet. In terms of an accessibility statement, which you need to produce for your website, you can say whether you're fully compliant, you're partially compliant, or you're not compliant. And there's a sort of distinction in that partially compliant is considered if you meet more than 50% of the success criterion. Non-compliant is if it's less than 50%. That's your own judgment. So you make your own judgment on that. You test your own website, you check that. In terms of monitoring, GDS is the monitoring body for these regulations. They will go around and sample websites and sample public sector organisations. They aren't able to test every public sector organisation. There's tens of thousands of them, and there are possibly 100,000 different public sector websites. So it will be done on a sampling basis, and it will be the case that they will check and analyse, and they will report back if they find issues. They will also report back if the accessibility statement doesn't match the reality, if you like.
Great. So does the internet content cover documents too?
Yes, it does. So, excuse me, documents will be covered by the same rules for the internet, I believe. But again, check with your lawyers on that one, because it's probably not entirely clear from the guidance in that situation, because I know there are some sort of hybrids where a public website links to some intranet documents and things like that. So you need to check with your lawyers on that one. But in common sense terms, I would say if it's within an intranet, then it's covered by the intranet rules.
Fab, thank you. Is there a recommended approach to auditing legacy sites?
Well, the recommended approach is really not necessarily for legacy sites, but for all sites. I would say my recommended approach is to use tools, automated tools, to find some of the basic issues, things like that. Do some manual testing, and there is guidance on that in our guidance around doing things like checking everything works with a keyboard, checking that images have alternative text, checking that you can use browser zoom to zoom up to a reasonable level without breaking things, those sort of things. Getting then the next part of the approach would be getting a web content accessibility guidelines audit done, which you can do internally if you have the skills to do it. There's no minimum requirement for who can do it, but it is kind of a specialized role, so it's probably, in most cases, you're probably likely to need to get an external company to do that for you. And then testing with users with disabilities, making sure that they can access things, and that covers usability as well. That goes over into that area as well, and it's just good business sense to do that. But also testing with assistive technologies. So if you can get access to assistive technologies to test these things, then do that. And you can access things freely if you use, things like Windows has built-in screen reader called Narrator. There's a free screen reader called NVDA, non-visual desktop access, and it also has built-in voice recognition, built-in Zoom. So there are assistive technologies you can use that are free if you don't have the budget to get the ones that are commonly used. Yeah, I think that's that.
Someone, oh, sorry, sorry about this. I'm trying to read too many things. I noticed in the do's for people with dyslexia, graphs and images are encouraged. We try to keep plain text where possible, as graphs may not be easily read by screen readers. How would you suggest making content accessible for both user types?
There's no perfect answer for a piece of content to make it fully accessible for everyone. It's about making it available in basic ways, so data and things like that, but also for some people images are much more useful. So for example, there's a whole area of easy read, which is text and images associated with it, which can be really helpful for many people with cognitive impairments. Plain text is good, but make sure you include things like structure. So just text like in a notepad text editor isn't very helpful when it comes to reading. And graphs, may not be easily read by screen readers. That's what I mentioned about having, for example, data tables. Data tables, if they're structured well and follow accessibility principles, they can be made accessible to screen readers, providing they're kept fairly simple and not complex tables. So there's no perfect answer to this, and there will always be compromises, and something that's fully accessible for one person may be inaccessible to another. So for example, I talked about good color contrast. The maximum level of color contrast is black text on white background or white text on a black background. But for some people, particularly someone who's dyslexic, that may be too extreme and may prevent them being able to read the content. So flexibility is key here, and following sort of reasonable guidelines.
Thanks. Schools are only partially covered by the regulations. Do educational websites and downloadable resources aimed at teachers to use in primary and secondary schools need to comply with the regulations?
I think that is a question for the lawyers, but I wouldn't say an educational website is necessarily the same as a school website. So if it's a sort of education provider that is, if it's a provider of information about resources for teachers and they're in the public sector, then I think they would need to comply with the regulations, but check with your lawyer. If they're in the commercial sector, they don't. So then it's down to organisations who use that content to effectively put pressure on a commercial sector to say, we need this in an accessible format, so we can't use it or we can't buy it or whatever it is.
Thank you. Is it possible to add an option for users to get in touch to make a request for an accessible version of a document if making the existing PDF accessible would be very difficult to do, e.g. strategic documents which include text and multiple maps?
Yes, it's always good practice to provide a means for people to request alternative formats anyway, and they should be able to do that, you know, if it's not on the page where the document is, they should be able to do that through your accessibility statement. It doesn't mean you don't have to make the document accessible, and effectively it's up to you to decide if that's a legal risk or not, whether you're publishing it and you're not meeting the requirements or not is kind of up to you. But yes, it's good to provide alternative formats that people can access, or that you provide them on request. It's definitely good though, if you do that, to make sure you have a good process in place to make sure they get a quick response to these things, and you know they get the information they want in the format they need. If it's like high profile, high priority information, then it's worth thinking about, should you make it more accessible anyway. You know, priority does come into it, and obviously historical information may not be quite so important from that point of view.
Thank you. For the deadline of the 23rd of September, do we need to have everything fixed that an audit highlights? Yeah. I think we may have heard that the accessibility statement can include a plan with timescales to state when things may be fixed.
Yeah, it's an interesting, what's the word, dilemma, if you like, that technically you need to make everything work and be fixed, but you should identify things that aren't fixed. So if you have things that aren't fixed, you do need to put them in the accessibility statement, but that doesn't mean that negates the legal risk, if you like, of not having everything accessible. But I think, you know, just thinking practically and pragmatically, it will be viewed as, you know, good if you are making plans to fix things and they're a reasonable timescale. There's no legal requirement on how long a good timescale is, but say you have a series of documents that you're saying you're going to fix in 3 months, that might be okay. If you say you're going to fix them in 5 years, that's probably not. But it's very sort of subjective in that sense. So it's, as I say, a bit of a dilemma, but yes, do identify things that you haven't fixed. And the purpose of the accessibility statement is twofold. One is for the monitoring body, but more importantly than that, it's for users to understand what information they might not be able to access, or how they can get those through alternative means. Also to allow them to contact you if there are issues and complain if they're not happy with your response to those contacts.
Thank you. For documents like financial reports or fire authority meetings, how can these be made more accessible?
That's a good question. Yeah, there are a lot of complex documents out there. I've seen some really fancy documents with lots of graphs and things like that. It is kind of a case of going back to the fundamentals and saying, what is the information being conveyed here, and how is the best way to convey it that's fully accessible. Unfortunately, I think it's kind of a cultural shift in many ways. You know, I love fancy charts and things like that. Interactive things, animations, all that sort of thing, but they create so many accessibility barriers that it's important to do that. But yeah, what you can do, I suppose, is think about what is the fundamental information in there that's really important, and you can prioritize it in that way. But it doesn't reduce your legal risk necessarily. So yeah, it's difficult.
Do videos provided by third parties need to be transcribed and captions too?
Yes, with the exception of, as I say, those that you don't procure or pay for. So if you're, yeah, it's a tricky one. If you think about the sort of maps example, the planning issues, if you're taking on content and you're not procuring it, but it would probably look bad if you did that, if you didn't at least encourage users providing information to provide transcripts and captions. But yes, I think technically you wouldn't need to, but you'd have to look at the exemptions for that.
Will there be any extensions in terms of compliance checks in light of COVID-19 stretching resources across the public sector?
To be blunt, no. The deadlines are fixed in law, so it would require a change to the law to do that. So the deadline of 23rd of September is in place and won't be changed. GDS will be taking a very collaborative approach with people, and it certainly won't be the case that, you know, come 24th of September, there'll be people up in courts. It'll be a very collaborative approach of reporting on issues, giving people time to fix things, and it'll only be, you know, if people don't cooperate or don't fix things, that then it could go on to the enforcement bodies. And in many senses, that's no different to the current situation where someone could complain about a website now and it will go through a process which could ultimately end up in the courts, but so far none of that has happened. So yeah, no, the dates aren't changing.
Okay. We've had a couple of questions in about documents that have been, so for example, handwritten and pictures. Would these all need to be transcribed?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, anything that is important information, or even, you know, well, it's got to be useful information. If it's there and people can access it, then you need to make sure it's accessible. So if it's handwritten notes and someone who's got good vision can read that and get that information, then there's no reason why someone who can't see it should have access to that information. That's obviously a tricky one, difficult to scan. No, it's difficult to convert into using optical character recognition. So that may have to be a manual process. But, you know, some of that comes down to maybe you need to change the way you keep these notes, or, you know, you think about the process of how you publish them, that sort of thing.
I'm just conscious of time. So shall we do one more question and then the other question shall we answer offline?
Sure.
Does that sound okay?
Yep.
That sounds good. So we have we're a centralized web team of 2 in a unitary authority. We just don't have the capacity to run bespoke user testing, as our website won't get updated. In a world of constant under-resourcing and cost saving, how would you recommend ensuring user needs are addressed?
Okay, in terms of the legislation, the new regulations, user testing isn't a requirement. It's not a legal requirement. The only legal requirement is that you meet the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.1 AA. It doesn't say how you do that. You don't have to do the testing with assistive technologies, all those sorts of things. They're best practice. And while I strongly encourage it, you have to be realistic about your resources. And yes, if you're a team of 2, you're going to struggle to do that. From an organizational point of view, there is a thing called disproportionate burden, where an organization can claim disproportionate burden for parts or all of their website if they don't have the resources available to achieve full accessibility. However, that can't be just because they haven't assigned enough people to it. You know, if it's a large organization, or if they haven't thought about it enough time. So, and you do have to do an analysis of that. So yeah, I hope that answers that. That's a good question. Yeah, we will try and take the other questions offline. We've nearly come to the end now. So I just want to thank everyone for taking part. I hope it's been useful. Yeah, good set of questions. And yeah, I hope you all get something out of this to be able to help you improve accessibility, because what this isn't just about meeting the regulations. This is about making things work for everyone. So thanks, and back to you, Alex.
Yes, thank you, Richard and Nancy. I think we're all really grateful for you coming here today and sharing your experience. And thanks to everyone at GDS, LGA and LG Comms for organising this. Mostly thanks for everyone who came today to hear this and to take the learning back into the public sector. As mentioned, we will be sending out the slides, and there were so many great questions we didn't get around to. We will be following up and sharing that as well. I'll leave the last word to Richard and Nancy. Good luck, everyone, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Just remember, this is for everyone.